Con ustedes el doctor Ike Ahmed, quien nos hablará de cirugía de catarata en el ojo pequeño y ángulo cerrado. Doctor.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming up nice and early. I have to say, it is difficult after spending the day in the Dominican sun and the cloud a little bit, having a really nice, restful sleep. So I think we're going to have a good time this morning talking about glaucoma. And I have a few talks this morning. My first talk is going to be on cataract surgery in angle closure and the small eye. This is something I hope that will be full of pearls for all cataract surgeons, but specifically with glaucoma, we know these are issues. So we, of course, I've talked about this, we know that these eyes are small, right? The question is, how small is small? Now, I apologize for the maybe poor sense of humor, but this was somebody who was visiting me. You know, I have a few people who visited me, you know, every week, and I gave him a shirt. I said, okay, quickly change your shirt because you have to wear the proper scrubs for the operating room. And he wore this all day. At the end of the day, I said, Mike, just look down for a second. So he looked down, and it was a little joke. It was a little joke. So don't worry. He's a good sport. He was happy. But the question is, how small is small? And when we think about the average eye being about 23.5 millimeters, a couple standard deviations away, we get to about 21, and then 3 standard deviations, we get to about 20. So, you know, basically, depending on how you define things, a nanophthalmic eye would be an eye that would be less than 20 millimeters. I know that, I think Mike is talking about nanophthalmia as well, and there might be some coverage. We know that lens removal in these eyes can be basically curative. It's not common to say we can cure glaucoma, but in angle closure, as you see here, this was a microspheric eye resulting in extreme shallowing of the chamber. We can see the dramatic change in the anterior chamber. We've seen, you know, fairly reasonable randomized controlled trials in patients who have both controlled and medically uncontrolled chronic angle closure, which of course is the most common presentation for angle closure, comparing phaco versus phaco-trab, showing that phaco actually does very well, in fact even better when it comes to functional outcomes. We now see randomized trials looking at lens removal versus iridectomy or iridotomy for primary angle closure or primary angle closure glaucoma. This was published in Lancet a couple years ago. And you can see the results show, and I won't go into too much detail, that the pressures were lower, less intervention after the primary intervention, and better quality of life in patients who had lens removal versus iridotomy for angle closure. Imagine again, patient has no glaucoma, they have angle closure, chronic angle closure, elevated IOP or synechia, and have lens removal versus a PI. So it really makes us debate what's the role of lens removal when it comes to angle closure. The challenge, of course, is we know there are many issues in doing cataract surgery in these difficult eyes. When do we do surgery, especially if they have an acute angle closure? Do we go in early? Do we go in later? Do we do laser first, as we asked? Managing the glaucoma is often a challenge. IOL calculations, of course, are a problem in these difficult eyes with biometry and formula selection here. Small pupil, posterior synechia, chamber depth, PAS formation, or dealing with it. The endothelium can often be weak. Zonules, of course, it can be a problem as well, sometimes the cause of the issue. Retinal issues and macular issues as well. And of course, we have to think about effusions and think about malignant glaucoma that can occur, and positive pressure either acutely or after. Phaco in these eyes, of course, are difficult. Do we create space? How do we create space? We have to create space, of course, to do our work and also to work away from the cornea. And we also have to prevent issues with further shallowing. I've termed this intraoperative malignant glaucoma. We can debate about what malignant glaucoma is. I'm of the school of thought of Harry Quigley and others that this isn't really aqueous misdirection. I think that term should be abolished from our terminology when it comes to glaucoma. There's no evidence that aqueous is misdirected in malignant glaucoma. However, there's evidence that we see a constellation of findings where we see choroidal expansion in the small eye, with resultant vitreous being compressed and reduction of conductivity of vitreous. We have a small lens iris channel, and we cannot re-equilibrate the positive pressure from the anterior chamber and the chamber shallows. This can happen acutely, happen chronically, and we see this in high-risk eyes like these small eyes as well. In these eyes that we see, we often do use mannitol. We like to give it preoperatively. Your surgery should be pretty efficient, of course, because otherwise patients are going to want to pee. I like using some of the super viscous cohesive agents. There's a debate. Do we do a pars plana vitreous tap to deepen the chamber? There's a question mark. And I will say I was somebody who never did general anesthesia, but in some of these very small eyes, I now do this because I really feel the control and the control of the pressure in the eye very important to prevent chamber shallowing. So use your favorite viscoelastic. I like using a dispersive to help protect the cornea. Again, I don't want to like to use trade names, but Helon 5 is a unique class of drug here and is very helpful at deepening the chamber. Incision management is important, fluidics are important, and always remember the chamber to keep it formed is really critical. I can't stress this enough, and you saw it yesterday, I talked about it as well, that as cataract surgeons, we try to keep the eye as physiologic as possible, and any shallowing of the chamber may result in the choroid expanding and the pressure building up here. Just to exhibit a case, this is a 33-year-old male nanophthalmist referred to me, came in with a pressure of 30 to 50, ranging quite a bit on maximum meds. You can see the chamber is very shallow. The patient's had a previous iridotomy a few years ago, wearing RGP lenses and a plus 15. Cornea for a 33-year-old was not in the best shape. And you can see the right eye compared to the left eye. The left eye, by the way, is small as well. But the right eye is really shallow. And we looked what's the cause of why this patient has a shallow chamber. I won't quiz everybody here, but we looked for everything like a choroidal detachment, effusion, posterior segment mass, a superciliary effusion, weak zonules, a big intumescent lens, something pushing posteriorly, all these question marks, really nothing was there. This patient actually presented with spontaneous malignant glaucoma, a very difficult condition to treat. It was difficult to assess the patient's fields, although there was certainly some RNFL loss, but poor quality imaging. We felt this patient had some glaucomatous changes already, and then, of course, we decided what we're going to do here. Now, I think you probably will agree, this is a very small, it's a 16 millimeter eye. We don't want to do a trabeculectomy or a tube. These are difficult scenarios to handle when in these small eyes. Now the IOL calculation, which is probably not the most important issue here, is challenging. Remember, most formulas assume a small eye equals a short anterior chamber and a small effective lens position. And a long eye, the lens will sit farther back. And this is true for the average eye, yes. But for the very small eye, in fact, we see a bit of an inverse relationship. And for the very long eye, we see an inverse relationship. So long eyes don't always have deep chambers, and short eyes don't always have shallow chambers. So using some of the modern generation formula, I particularly like the Olsen formula and the Barrett formula for these eyes. This is the patient's biometry, 16.44, 16.1. The right eye is the one of concern. 1.4 AC depth, a 4.73 millimeter lens thickness. So not a very huge lens, but certainly a big lens for this eye as well, with steep Ks, which is not uncommon. Lens selection, I think that more and more, I think the evidence is that we should not be doing piggyback lenses. Remember, this formula predicted a 57 diopter lens. You know, of course, we don't want to do the piggyback. There's not enough room in these eyes. And so in these eyes, at least in Canada, I can't speak for other places around the world, we can order an Extreme D lens, which is a nice 60 plus diopter foldable lens. It's a diffractive design. Not a multifocal, it's a monofocal, and it's a nice lens that can go through a small incision. We published a series of these. Our most readily available lens implant is the SA60 lens, up to 40 diopters. So this is the patient here that I just presented. It's a small white to white, as we said. I have general rules. I'd be interested to hear what Michael feels about managing these cases. I have a general rule. By the way, look at all the synechia present here. If the eye is less than 18 millimeters, I typically routinely do scleral windows. I didn't do this all the time, but in our series, and we published our series, we have over 80 eyes of less than 18 millimeters, and we found that without doing a scleral window, even though there's no effusion present now, post-operatively there's a risk, and we typically make a little window here, a cut down. Look how thick that sclera is, typically in 1 or 2 quadrants. Nasally and temporally there. We often see some immersive fluid. This allows allows the flow of supraciliary fluid that may accumulate in the intraoperative or postoperative period. And we'll leave it open and we'll deal with this. Now, the big question for us is, do we do a pars plana tap? Remember, this patient had a 1.4 millimeter anterior chamber depth. I elected not to because we have not had the best experience, and others as well. There's viscoelastic. We still see some synechia with these eyes. And the reason why is because we don't know exactly where the ora serrata is. In an average eye, you can go back 3.5, 4 millimeters, and you can be pretty safe that will be through pars, but not through retina. In these eyes, the retina can insert 2.5 millimeters from the limbus. So where do we exactly make that incision? We use UBM routinely. We try to predict where it is. And we can often get an idea. In this case, we were not confident that we could identify the ora posteriorly enough on our imaging, and so I know we struggle a little bit. This is a small eye. We put some Helon 5 in. We get the rexus done. Hydrodissection, very careful to ensure we don't let the chamber shallow or the iris prolapse. The lens is soft, so we remove the lens. But before coming out, we inject not BSS even, but viscoelastic. This patient had mannitol, by the way, pre-op, and is under general anesthesia. So, and a young patient as well. So therefore, we have really ultimate control of the eye. The chamber doesn't shallow. There's positive pressure, but I'm able to re-equilibrate against it here using viscoelastic as well. Lens goes in, and then we will quickly suture that wound, so we have no less risk of chamber shallowing. My other rule is that for eyes, again, that are less than 20 millimeters in length, I very commonly will do an irido, zonulo, capsulo, hyaloid vitrectomy. What I mean by that is making a good-sized iridectomy, cutting through the zonules and the capsule, cutting through the anterior hyaloid and some vitreous, and you'll see the chamber deepen up, to create a unicameral eye. The treatment and the prevention of malignant glaucoma is actually pretty simple. It's to create a unicameral eye. The treatment is not to do a big vitrectomy. Without creating a unicameral eye, the treatment may not be successful. And so we basically push the cutter with viscoelastic in the eye posteriorly. Of course, we want to avoid the ciliary processes. We go somewhat perpendicular here. Remove a small aliquot of vitreous is all we need. Keep the chamber formed. I did this without infusion. And now the chamber deepens immediately. At this point in time, we have to address the synechia, so we use a pair of forceps using a gonio mirror. This is a flip view to do a 360-degree release of the synechia here. And now the trabecular meshwork can at least breathe and hopefully function. The problem is we don't know how long this has been going on for in this chronic situation here. And doing a phaco with goniosynechialysis, will it be enough or not is the question. I don't want to combine the procedure with trabeculectomy or a tube. I want to avoid this, but I think this may be a role for MIGS. And so the benefit of MIGS, of course, is the safety. We're not going to get hypotony or chamber shallowing with a couple of eye stents in the trabecular meshwork in the canal. But we may overcome the trabecular meshwork dysfunction if it's chronic in nature. We've seen histopathology and chronic angle closure, where we see ingrowth of fibrous tissue in the trabecular meshwork. This will hopefully at least be able to bypass that and help manage these situations here. Again, we'll close the conjunctiva, leaving the scleral window open, and post-operative. This is post-op day 1. You can see the chamber is nice and deep. This patient did very well. Look at the chamber depth, nice and open, The UBM shows, again, a deep chamber here. You know, look at the chamber in this case. You know, it's a 4 millimeter antechamber depth, right? This is a deep chamber that's present. Sometimes even despite the attempt to keep the chamber formed, we cannot keep the chamber formed. What do we do here? Well, there's been given mannitol. These are situations where reluctantly I think we may consider to do a pars plana tap. And if we particularly have, again, good imaging and be confident of our pars plana, we can then approach this. I talked a bit about vitrectomy. I know Michael's going to talk about vitrectomy as well, so I won't go through details about managing these cases. But I want to just mention one more thing is, again, when we do angle closure surgery, it's important to address the synechia using instrumentation like forceps, using gonio mirrors and gonio lenses to do that. And as I showed, this is another case of angle closure. Being able to evaluate the angle here with a gonio mirror can be very effective to visualize during the release of synechia. And it's very rewarding to release the iris adhesions that are present, because phaco alone, the patient had phaco actually, still wasn't successful. We were able to relieve the angle closure mechanism, at least the pretrabecular meshwork obstruction that's present. So we've just reviewed angle closure and small eyes, the lens removal, the challenge with the phaco, adding adjunctive modalities that are necessary. These are difficult eyes, but can be very rewarding and actually curative in their solution. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la doctora Arbaje y muchas gracias al doctor Asilis por la invitación. Siento mucho tener que alternar con el doctor Ahmed, puesto que ahora con mis pláticas va a resultar que las de él no son tan buenas como las mías, pero vamos a tratar de que no se sienta mal, ¿no? Pues gracias a todos y de veras es un gusto estar aquí. Como dijo la doctora Arbaje, ya es la cuarta vez que estamos con ustedes y les agradezco mucho. Vamos a hablar del paciente con sospecha de glaucoma. Ya desde 1977, como pueden ver ustedes aquí en esta cita, Chandler y Grant hablaban sobre terminología como glaucoma primario de ángulo abierto temprano, hipertensión ocular, sospecha de glaucoma y glaucoma preperimétrico. Para establecer mejor a qué nos referimos cuando empleamos estos términos, pues el sospechoso de glaucoma es aquel individuo que tiene uno o más factores de riesgo para desarrollar glaucoma, pero que no tiene cambios clínicos o campimétricos que puedan confirmar la enfermedad. El hipertenso ocular es aquel paciente que va a tener una presión intraocular de 21 o más en 2 ocasiones diferentes, sin defectos en el campo visual. La exploración del nervio óptico y de la capa de fibras nerviosas son normales, los ángulos están abiertos y que además se ha descartado cualquier otra causa por la cual pueda haber una elevación de la presión intraocular. Y el paciente con glaucoma preperimétrico es un individuo que cumple con los criterios diagnósticos para glaucoma, pero que no tiene alteraciones en los estudios blanco-blanco, pero sí tiene alteraciones o cambios demostrados en estudios funcionales, otro diferente al campo visual blanco-blanco, o en los estudios estructurales. ¿Cuáles son los factores de riesgo para los cuales debemos de estar atentos en este grupo de pacientes? Pues el principal y el más importante es la presión intraocular alta. La edad avanzada es otro de ellos, el antecedente familiar positivo para glaucoma, alteraciones en la presión arterial, una menor paquimetría, hemorragias del nervio óptico, el aumento del tamaño de la excavación del nervio óptico, aumento de la desviación estándar en el campo visual, alteraciones vasculares y miopía. Esta es una diapositiva tomada de los Preferred Practice Patterns de la American Academy of Ophthalmology. Y en México tenemos una publicación en la cual también identificamos algunos otros factores de riesgo que son determinantes o importantes para determinar si hay o no hay glaucoma. Y vemos que aunque tenemos una constelación de síntomas o de signos, hay algunos que son más importantes que otros y recordamos que el más importante es la elevación de la presión intraocular. Existen diferentes causas por las cuales se va a generar la neuropatía óptica por glaucoma. Tenemos factores vasculares, factores mecánicos, hay algunos factores genéticos que intervienen y otros factores como el envejecimiento, la miopía, la diabetes y fenómenos autoinmunes que no tenemos a ciencia cierta el conocimiento de cómo es que esto funciona e incide para la génesis del glaucoma. Tenemos una línea muy delicada, una línea muy fina, con la cual en algunos pacientes no sabemos exactamente cómo definirlos o cómo catalogarlos. Tenemos el paciente que claramente tiene glaucoma y que está muy bien clasificado, el paciente que no tiene glaucoma, que también está muy bien clasificado. El problema son los pacientes sospechosos de glaucoma y los que tienen glaucoma preperimétrico que de alguna manera entran en el mismo grupo y que no sabemos exactamente para ese grupo de pacientes cuál es la conducta que nosotros debemos de seguir. Precisamente para ese grupo de pacientes debemos de ser cuidadosos y detallados en nuestra evaluación y con nuestros estudios. Repitiendo que la presión intraocular es el principal factor de riesgo para el desarrollo de glaucoma y para el cual el grosor corneal central también es un factor importante en cuanto a la propensión o la factibilidad de que un paciente pueda tener glaucoma. Se ha ya comprobado que a menor grosor corneal central, mayor riesgo de glaucoma, y a mayor grosor corneal, menor riesgo de glaucoma, con el impacto que esto significa también en la presión intraocular, sin que con esto yo quiera decir que debemos de corregir la presión intraocular porque no hay ninguna fórmula adecuada para realizarlo. Es importante recordar que las alteraciones de la capa de fibras nerviosas siempre son antes de que existan alteraciones en el campo visual, y es por eso que tenemos que evaluar el nervio óptico y la capa de fibras nerviosas de manera muy detallada. La fluctuación de la presión intraocular es algo también muy importante. Vemos en este otro estudio que la fluctuación de la presión en ojos de pacientes que no tienen glaucoma es de menos de 4 milímetros de mercurio, y la fluctuación en los pacientes con glaucoma sin tratamiento puede ser de hasta 11 milímetros de mercurio. Algo que pocas veces estudiamos es la presión de perfusión ocular. Esto se tiene que hacer cuando realizamos una curva horaria de 24 horas. Es importante también tomar la presión arterial porque estas cifras nos van a poder ayudar a determinar cuál es la presión de perfusión ocular diastólica y, de acuerdo al valor que nos dé esta ecuación, determinar el riesgo que este paciente determinado podrá tener para desarrollar glaucoma, con la tabla que vemos aquí, ¿no? 50 o más, el riesgo es 1, es decir, un paciente normal, y a medida que la presión de perfusión va bajando de 50, va aumentando el riesgo, de tal manera que cuando la presión de perfusión ocular diastólica es menor a 30, el riesgo de glaucoma se eleva a 6.22 veces. Aquí vemos también en esta gráfica cómo la presión de perfusión ocular está íntimamente relacionada con el desarrollo de glaucoma. A menor presión de perfusión ocular vemos cómo dramáticamente aumenta el porcentaje de pacientes con glaucoma. Esta gráfica es importante porque nos establece que las curvas de daño en el glaucoma no son paralelas. Vemos que lo último que se daña es el campo visual. Antes de dañarse el campo visual se daña el nervio óptico. Previo al daño del nervio óptico se daña la capa de fibras nerviosas, y antes de dañarse todavía la capa de fibras nerviosas existe la alteración en la capa de células ganglionares. Esto lo menciono porque al paciente que tiene glaucoma o sospechoso de glaucoma hay que diagnosticarlo tempranamente. ¿Para qué? Para que podamos llevar a ese paciente al final de su vida, si es que desarrolla glaucoma, en una situación tal que pueda tener una adecuada visión y una buena calidad de vida hasta el final de sus días. Existen diferentes estudios que nos pueden permitir evaluar adecuadamente tanto la estructura o la función, porque todavía no podemos saber exactamente qué es mejor evaluar, si la función o estructura, pero ahorita con las siguientes diapositivas ustedes mismos llegarán a esa conclusión. El campo visual, sabemos todos que es una manera objetiva de poder cuantificar el daño por glaucoma. El campo visual está encaminado a evaluar a las células ganglionares, y dependiendo de la estrategia va a ser el grupo de células ganglionares al que el campo visual estará evaluando. Aquí la ventaja para el diagnóstico temprano es que los equipos del FT Matrix y la perimetría de onda corta o azul amarillo nos permiten realizar más tempranamente la detección de daño por glaucoma. Y esto se debe a que, por ejemplo, el sistema Matrix va a evaluar solamente el 15% de las fibras del nervio óptico, que corresponde al sistema magnocelular, y dentro de este sistema va a evaluar solamente entre el 15 y el 25%, que son un subtipo de células Mi, que corresponden a tan solo entre el 2 y 3% del total de las células ganglionares de la retina. Y el campo visual azul-amarillo va a evaluar el sistema coniocelular, que corresponde también al 2% del total de las células ganglionares. Y como decíamos, el defecto de capa de fibras nerviosas precede a las alteraciones del campo visual. Vean ustedes aquí este defecto temporal inferior, que para el campo visual blanco-blanco pues todavía no representa ninguna alteración. Hablando de la capa de fibras nerviosas y del complejo de células ganglionares, decíamos que esta es otra alternativa útil para poder realizar el diagnóstico temprano. Igual, aquí vemos la célula ganglionar, y dependiendo del equipo de OCT, este estudio de células ganglionares será la evaluación de las 3 primeras o de las 2 primeras capas, de las 3 primeras o de las 2 segundas capas, dependiendo la marca del OCT. Y la importancia de esto es que el 50% de las células ganglionares están concentradas al centro de la fóvea, y dentro del primer milímetro parafoveal se encuentra el mayor número de estas, y es donde decíamos se inicia el daño por glaucoma. Y como ejemplo pongo este OCT. Específicamente quiero que se enfoquen en el ojo derecho. Vemos cómo hay una alteración limítrofe en el sector superior, temporal superior, que tan solo lo marca con amarillo, pero que al correlacionarlo con el análisis de células ganglionares vemos que para ese sector tenemos un daño ya considerable para el ojo derecho. Es importante comentar también que dependiendo del sitio donde encontremos la alteración de capa de fibras nerviosas, esto se corresponderá con una correlación anatómica en la alteración de capa de células ganglionares, de tal manera que si la alteración de capa de fibras nerviosas está muy hacia los polos, puede ser posible que la capa de células ganglionares no detecte la alteración, como ven ustedes en el caso de abajo. También es importante comentar que pueden haber falsos positivos, como el primer caso que ven ustedes a su izquierda, en el cual es un paciente que tiene cambios refractivos por miopía alta y que, aunque aparecen zonas en rojo, este paciente no tiene daño por glaucoma, a diferencia del caso que ven ustedes a su derecha, en el que sí hay una correlación anátomo-funcional y cambios por glaucoma. Voy a presentar un caso de una paciente que acude porque en su familia hay un patrón importante de pacientes con glaucoma. Su madre tiene glaucoma, su padre tiene glaucoma, los tíos maternos tienen glaucoma, y ella acude a revisión. Y los nervios ópticos los veo ligeramente amplios. No, nada que llame la atención, pero si vemos cuidadosamente para el ojo izquierdo, en el sector temporal superior, vemos unas pequeñas estriaciones en la capa de fibras nerviosas que, además del antecedente que tenía la paciente, pues fue lo que me llamó la atención y dije, esta paciente hay que estudiarla un poquito más. Aquí vemos el aumento de la excavación de los nervios ópticos y vemos unas excavaciones aparentemente normales, todo bien, una capa de fibras nerviosas peripapilar normal, pero aquí vemos en la fotografía libre de rojo cómo los defectos temporal superior del ojo izquierdo son más evidentes que en la fotografía de color. En el campo visual vemos que el ojo derecho muestra una depresión central que no corresponde ni correlaciona con el hallazgo de la fotografía clínica, pero en el ojo izquierdo vemos una alteración nasal inferior que podría corresponder con la alteración temporal superior que vimos en la capa de fibras nerviosas. Hacemos un estudio de OCT en el cual vemos que para el ojo izquierdo no hay ningún defecto que esté marcado en el mapa de desviación, pero en el mapa de grosores, en la parte superior, vemos que hay un defecto que todavía apenas está insinuándose, que se correlaciona con las alteraciones de capa de fibras nerviosas y que el análisis de células ganglionares es normal. Al hacer un estudio con un aparato diferente, vemos que también sale normal y que este aparato no correlaciona el daño detectado, por ejemplo, en el ojo izquierdo con las estriaciones que vimos en el sector temporal superior del ojo derecho, pero al hacer un estudio de curva horaria con la determinación de presión arterial, vemos que las presiones de perfusión ocular para el ojo derecho y para el ojo izquierdo están en valores muy bajos. E incluso a la 1 de la mañana se encuentran por debajo de los 30 milímetros de mercurio, para lo cual vemos que su riesgo de desarrollar glaucoma es de 6 veces más que un paciente normal. Como resumen, quiero comentar que en el paciente con sospecha de glaucoma debemos de realizar una evaluación minuciosa, debemos de realizar pruebas funcionales y estructurales y correlacionar los hallazgos de las mismas con la exploración que nosotros hagamos del fondo del ojo, de nervio óptico, papila y capa de fibras nerviosas. Tenemos que hacer un análisis cuidadoso de los datos y de acuerdo a esto determinar cómo vamos a encasillar a nuestro paciente y si amerita que hagamos o no algún tipo de intervención, ya sea una intervención temprana con láser o que dejemos tratamiento médico para controlar la presión intraocular. Muchas gracias por su atención y nada más comentarles. Va a ser el Congreso Panamericano en Cancún el año que entra, al cual están cordialmente invitados. Muchas gracias.
Just present some cases to talk about some of the glaucoma conundrums and challenges that we see. Some of them are surgical. Well, most of them are surgical. Some of them are a little different. Let me pull it up here for a second here. Okay, so let's start with this one here, which is basically a patient who is not uncommon in our practice. A patient who has progressive normal pressure glaucoma, and how do we manage this? Mauricio gave a very nice overview on the important aspects of assessing a glaucoma patient, not just on a field, not just on an image. Let's look at this patient. This is a 52-year-old, somewhat young South Asian male, diagnosed 10 years ago with normal pressure glaucoma, so fairly young. Corneas are a little thin. This patient is very compliant. I know this because he's a local lawyer, and I've known him for many years. Pressures have been 12, 11 on 4 classes. SLT has been done a few times in the past as well. This is the right eye and the left eye, you can see, with a fair amount of visual field damage already in this young patient here. And the imaging, again, correlates quite well with what we saw in the visual field. We can see the particularly worsening of the inferior RNFL and the inferior macula, which is present. And we'll talk a bit about imaging future as well. Looking at the progression, which I think is the most important aspect of a glaucoma follow-up, is determining whether a patient is progressing or not. And you can see, let's look at the left eye first. I'm sorry it's black and white here. But on the imaging here, looking at the linear regression and the Tisnet plot, it looks quite stable over multiple visits. The right eye, however, is showing a trend for worsening here, particularly of the superior RNFL that's present. And you can see on the Tisnet plot in the bottom left, there's a depression, there's a flattening effect of the superior RNFL. The visual field, left eye again, shows pretty stable visual fields, at least on the GPA analysis, which is something I think that is very helpful on a single printout, the ability to assess multiple fields using trend analysis and also looking at event analysis. Not much change really to report. But the right eye, again, which is the one that showed the progression on the RNFL, also shows progression on the visual field, particularly inferiorly, with a new defect occurring here. So this patient has certainly evidence of RNFL loss and functional loss on the visual field, and they correlate nicely together. So we have a pretty good evidence this patient is getting worse, despite the patient having a pressure running around 12 to 13 millimeters of mercury. So what do we do for the investigations? I mean, there's a lot of things that we do in these situations here, and the message here, one of the messages for this presentation here is thinking about the patient as a whole. So compliance is a big thing to talk about. We certainly address it with all our patients. I always ask about smoking. I think smoking is a certain problem, and I apologize because I know how much the Dominicans love their cigars, but I'm sure you don't smoke that much. But smoking, we know, can sometimes be a factor in these type of vasospastic eyes. Lifestyle, I always ask about, do they keep the patients, and how often are they doing head down positions? Do they sleep on one side? Do they sleep on the right side more? Valsalva, playing wind instruments, these are all important. I often do 24-hour blood pressure, looking for hypotension, particularly at night, particularly on patients who are on blood pressure medications. Mauricio spoke about this, looking at perfusion pressure. It's really become an important risk factor. Sleep apnea is something as well we readily look at. We know there's some association with sleep apnea and glaucoma, and so we have access to sleep lab. We can send patients for 24-hour, or for overnight, I should say, sleep studies. IOP is important, and then we sometimes do neuroimaging, particularly in a young patient with more central loss or pallor or color vision loss. In this patient here, we set the patient home on eye care. I'll talk about this in my next talk a little bit, but this is a home measurement device using rebound tonometry. This has been something we've been using quite a bit. And what we see in this patient here in the right eye, which is in orange, we see every morning, particularly before the drop school, when we see the pressure going up to 20. The left eye doesn't seem to have the same type of pattern, but the right eye certainly does. Well, the question is, what do we do in this patient here? Do we continue to observe? That really was not an ideal scenario considering the progression. SLT has been performed multiple times already, so I think doing it again has diminishing returns. Pilocarpine and Diamox are always options, but how much lower can we go on medications? And then we have compliance and other issues and side effects. You know, MIGS certainly, we love the safety of MIGS, but we know that the typical MIGS devices don't lower pressure low enough in these situations. I think the answer here is we need to think about something going externally. We need to think about going into a bleb. Now we have various options. We'll talk about them tomorrow in more detail. But subconjunctival MIGS using microstents, microshunts, trabeculectomy, of course, is our gold standard, and tube shunts. I generally don't do tube shunts primarily unless the patient has a high risk for failure, previous surgery, previous conjunctival surgery, or poor conjunctiva. Cycloablation and micropulse, I typically reserve that more as a refractory condition here. We actually ended up performing a subconjunctival MIGS procedure using a microshunt, the InFocus microshunt, which is with mitomycin C creating a bleb. And this patient ended up having pressures below 10 millimeters of mercury. We can see the difference between pre-op and post-op. And we see the pressure control we have, pressures ranging from about 5 to 8 millimeters of mercury. And the patient with a thin cornea was perfect. And we find that the fluctuation in pressure and the control of fluctuation with a bleb-based procedure is excellent. The problem with trabeculectomy, of course, is the control and the predictability. But moving from trabeculectomy to subconjunctival MIGS, again, we'll talk about this tomorrow, and in this case, the InFocus, has given us a high degree of potency with added safety and control. This next patient, the patient referred to me for trabeculectomy. It's a bit of a long detail here, but the patient has a history of glaucoma, has cataract surgery done about 3-4 years prior, had a toric lens, vision is 20/40 in that eye. The patient's on 5 medications, and the glaucoma is early, right? Cup-to-disc ratio is not that big, but the pressure is elevated up to 30 millimeters of mercury you see there in the right eye. And the patient's looking for a trabeculectomy or an alternative. Patients, like I said, on acetazolamide. So you can see that the visual field is not terribly damaged. This is the right eye, this is the left eye. The RNFL shows some early changes, some early loss, but again, not too bad. But when we examine the patient, we see the patient has a one-piece lens in the bag sulcus position. Okay, so what I mean is basically one haptic is in the bag, the other haptic is sitting in the sulcus. You can see the position of the IOL on the UBM. And when we examine the patient, this patient has pigment dispersion, has lots of pigment on the iris and in the trabecular meshwork. So rather than doing trabeculectomy, what we decided to do in this case is, let's address the primary problem, which is pigment dispersion from the lens on top of the patient's open-angle glaucoma. So what we'll do first, we'll look and put some viscoelastic in. Again, here's a situation where I think internal MIGS may have a role. We don't have severe damage. The pressure is quite elevated. And we have a primary problem. Look at the pigmentation in the angle. This is not normal. The other eye had trace pigmentation. This has about 3+ pigmentation because of the UGG syndrome due to the bag sulcus position of the lens. But the addition of eye stents will hopefully help to lower the pressure. And by removing the primary problem, or the secondary problem here in this case, which is the lens chafing the iris, we may have enough control here to avoid a trabeculectomy. Of course, I warned the patient they may need something. Now, the patient, I think this was like a T6 or T7. The patient really wanted their astigmatism to be corrected, so I didn't promise that. I said, listen, let me examine you, let me see what we're going to do. We will certainly think about explanting the lens and putting a 3-piece lens in. The sulcus was okay. This patient has a huge capsular rhexis, very large. That haptic I just removed from the bag, but the rest of the lens is sitting in the sulcus. It's not a 1-piece lenses should never be in the sulcus. And the worst place for a 1-piece lens is not the sulcus, it's the bag sulcus, because the lens is tilted. But we want to avoid that. Now in this case here, I could not put the lens back in the capsular bag. The rhexis was huge. But we have the posterior capsule still intact, and we really like to use the capsule as much as possible to support the IOL. 1-piece lenses should not be placed in an optic capture position either, because the haptics will be sitting up against the iris. But doing a posterior rhexis and placing the optic anterior to the capsule and the haptics behind the capsule, basically the so-called reverse optic capture technique, is certainly, I think, a reasonable option. The lens is well secured in the capsule shelf. To do this, though, we need to hold the lens, put viscoelastic to ensure we don't have vitreous prolapse, and pass the haptic underneath the posterior capsule. Basically, we're taking advantage of the space present between the capsule and the anterior hyaloid. Of course, if vitreous prolapse, we need to do vitrectomy to do this. And I'm very carefully placing the lens axis so it's basically consistent with the preoperative axis of interest. And we now have the lens which is well secured. The haptics are behind the capsule, and the optic is sitting anterior. So this is called reverse optic capture. It's a very reasonable approach for a single-piece lens. If you break the bag and you want to put a toric lens in, you have a good capsular rhexis, another good position for it. We can see the keratoscopy present, and here's the position. You can see the optic present on the anterior to the posterior capsule and anterior capsule, which is fused. And there's the lens. You can see it's well positioned behind the iris because it's being held by the capsular shelf. So 1-piece lenses, they should be in the bag, but putting it in a bag optic capture position, reverse optic capture position, is also an option as well. There's a bit of snow for you here because I know you don't get it down in Dominican here. So this patient here presented with a very, very shallow anterior chamber after cataract surgery. Now you already heard me talk about malignant glaucoma, so I'll just skip right to the point. But this is a case of misdiagnosis. It's a very bad case, actually, I'll be honest with you, because this patient had routine cataract surgery in May 2012. The surgeon noted some shallowing postoperatively and was sent to a glaucoma specialist who recommended trabeculectomy. Patient had trabeculectomy here a couple months later, had to have a needling to revise it. It failed, had a second trabeculectomy, and had persistent shallowing of the chamber. Why? Because the patient has malignant glaucoma. However, it was not treated. It was treated medically, was treated with cycloplegic, had a vitrectomy, had a complete vitrectomy done, and had then chamber filled with C3F8 expansol gas, and came to me basically where they had given up. There's no other options for this patient. I examined the patient, saw the very shallow chamber. The posterior segment was normal. There was no choroidal. The cornea was terrible shape after all the manipulation. And we basically said, you know what? You have malignant glaucoma. Let's basically create a unicameral eye. All I did was place the cutter through the iridectomy, which has already been done by the trabeculectomy, to now create a unicameral situation here, like I talked about earlier. I'm putting the cutter through. There's really no vitreous present. I also will do goniosynechial lysis, because of course we have synechiae now because of the entire shallow chamber. And by the way, I could have done a laser as well, to laser through the iridectomy and the capsule and the highlight if it was present. But the chamber was very shallow and the patient has synechia, so we took the patient to the OR. And we will continue to release the synechia here, so our angle is open. We can do this cutter through the anterior chamber as well. I just put some Kenalog to check for vitreous, but again, the patient had a vitrectomy already. So it's a good example that doing a vitrectomy alone is not enough. Is not enough for these patients, and these patients have to have a unicameral eye, which is very important to perform here. There's another picture of ROR. So this next patient here has a history of chronic angle closure. Maximum meds, pressures were 25, 29 on all these meds plus Diamox. Minimal damage. So we did lens removal, which is what I talked about. We're going to synechiolysis. Worked beautifully. Patient's pressure came down. They're off their medications. Sought the pilocarpine. I'm happy. Go home. We cured your problem. But patient came back 6 months later with pressures of 42 and 45. Deep chamber, but PAS came back. So we started the medications back, but the patient has synechia. And what's going on here? This patient does not have malignant glaucoma. The chamber is deep. But the patient has big ciliary processes, has plateau iris. And plateau iris does not always resolve with moving the lens, because the chamber is deep, but the peripheral chamber is not. So we did something that's a little bit innovative. First of all, we did, again, my favorite thing, which is going to synechiolysis to relieve the iris. But I needed to basically resolve the patient's peripheral crowding. So I could put the patient on pilocarpine chronically, but what we did here is we did a mid-peripheral iris cerclage. You know, we love to, of course, repair the iris with pupillary cerclages and iris suturing techniques. Many years ago, we did these procedures and we found that, of course, the benefit of doing a pupil cerclage is we keep the iris on stretch. The problem is, of course, the pupil does not dilate. So why not do a mid-peripheral cerclage? So we're placing the tenoproline in the mid-peripheral iris all the way around in a purse string, okay, to basically then tie the suture to put the peripheral iris on tension. This, of course, will not impact the patient's accommodation, although the patient is pseudophakic here, and the pupil can still be dilated. In effect, we get a pilocarpine effect without the pilocarpine here. We tie the suture somewhat tight, and you can see when I deepen the chamber, the peripheral iris is stretched, but the central pupil is still functional. So this is what we call the mid-peripheral iris cerclage, fairly straightforward in the pseudophakic eye, and we see the suture here imbricated in the iris, and we can look at the iris on stretch. Look at the iris on stretch here. It looks like a pilocarpine pupil, but the pupil is still functional. And so this is a great option. And not only does it actually keep the iris away from the angle, it actually stretches and actually, I believe, pulls on the trabecular meshwork to enhance the trabecular meshwork outflow as well. So these are some interesting situations that I just reviewed quickly on challenging cases, thinking a bit out of the box and managing these cases with some innovative surgical solutions. Again, thank you very much, and I'll call back Mauricio. It's the Ike and Mauricio show this morning. Thank you.
No, siempre un placer y un gusto ver las pláticas del doctor Ike Ahmed. Siempre muestra cosas impresionantes y con mucha imaginación y mucha habilidad. Bueno, vamos a hablar sobre perlas en implantes de Ahmed. Quisiera comenzar con la primera perla y creo que la más importante que hemos tenido en este sentido en el Hospital de la Asociación para Evitar la Ceguera en México. Y es la técnica de túnel escleral desarrollada por el doctor Félix Gil Carrasco, en la que no se necesita ningún material para cubrir el tubo y solamente se hace un túnel intraescleral con una aguja calibre 23 o 22, de la manera con la que ven ustedes aquí en este video. Y el motivo por el cual se desarrolló esa técnica fue porque cuando llegó la válvula de Ahmed a México no teníamos ningún material permitido por la Secretaría de Salud para poder hacer el recubrimiento del tubo. Y es por eso que se desarrolló esta técnica del túnel, ya de todos conocida. Esta técnica se ha presentado ya en diferentes foros y es un estudio que se realizó con 8.700 cirugías y una revisión de 840 expedientes de julio de 1993 a 2009. No se revisaron las 8.700 cirugías, sino de estas 8.700 se seleccionaron solamente 840 expedientes al azar. Y como factor principal o resultado principal de esta técnica es que el porcentaje de exposición del tubo en estos 840 pacientes fue solamente 0.4% de 4 pacientes que se les extruyó el tubo. ¿Quién que ha operado un glaucoma neovascular al día siguiente no se ha encontrado con una situación de estas en cámara anterior? Es muy común que después de hacer una cirugía de válvula de Ahmed en un paciente con glaucoma neovascular tengamos un sangrado importante, un hipema, el cual, vean ustedes aquí, está inclusive obstruyendo la luz del tubo. Aquí vemos un acercamiento y bueno, esto es un problema, ¿no? Porque son pacientes que tienen presiones intraoculares muy altas. La manera de solucionar esta situación al momento de tener el hipema es dar solamente unos cuantos disparos de JAG en la boca del tubo para permeabilizar el ostium y que pueda funcionar la válvula de Ahmed. Tenemos este otro tipo de problemas en el cual vemos que hay un coágulo también alrededor del tubo, pero si nos fijamos bien, vemos que en este caso la luz del tubo no está ocluida, está permeable y la presión está controlada. Para este caso no hay que hacer nada, solo observar. Hay que tener cuidado con las suturas que damos para cerrar la conjuntiva después de una válvula de Ahmed, porque si no damos la sutura adecuadamente, al retirar la sutura, vemos si esta fue de espesor total, que ahora tenemos un seidel a través del orificio que ha dejado la sutura en la esclera. Esto también lo podemos ver en algunas ocasiones, es por el estrechamiento de la cámara anterior y el desplazamiento anterior del diafragma iridocristaliniano. Vemos que aquí el iris está ocluyendo la luz del tubo. Y bueno, para solucionar este problema lo que hicimos fue entrar en la córnea periférica con una aguja montada en una jeringa con viscoelástico, profundizar la cámara anterior y hacer un barrido de el iris hacia abajo para liberar la boca del tubo que está obstruida por el iris. Casos en los cuales tenemos vítreo entrampado en el tubo de la válvula, como ven ustedes aquí, que el vítreo inclusive está deformando la pupila. Cuando es una pequeña banda de vítreo y este no es abundante, con unos disparos de JAG se libera esa banda, la banda pasa a través del tubo, va al reservorio de la vesícula y se restablece el adecuado flujo a través del tubo. Vemos que inclusive la forma de la pupila ha mejorado y cambiamos la evolución de la presión intraocular. Cuando tenemos vítreo de estas características en el tubo, aquí lo que voy a recomendar es no hacer disparos de JAG. Aquí lo que debemos de hacer cuando el vítreo es así de abundante es una adecuada vitrectomía para quitar ese vítreo de ahí, liberarlo adecuadamente y evitar que este vuelva a ser absorbido por la presión negativa que genera el tubo dentro de la cámara anterior. Este es un paciente posoperado de válvula de Ahmed por un glaucoma secundario a una uveitis herpética. Vemos que el tubo ahora ha sido envuelto por el iris y que la luz del tubo, la boca del tubo está tapada por el iris. Nada más vemos ahí un pequeño orificio donde se alcanza a ver el tubo, y este problema lo resolvimos dando unos disparos de JAG sobre el iris que estaba obstruyendo la luz del tubo, y después de los disparos de JAG unos disparos de argón para aplanar y dejar más estable la superficie, porque el JAG lo deja todo despeluchado, por así decirlo, lo deja muy irregular con fragmentos de iris que pueden ir a obstruir la luz del tubo, y con el argón lo que hacemos es aplanarlo para evitar que estos fragmentos o porciones de iris vuelvan a ir a tapar la luz del tubo. Para cuando suturemos la válvula de Ahmed, de preferencia no suturar con mersilene, porque el mersilene es una sutura que tiende a extruirse, como ven ustedes aquí en este paciente, en el cual vemos la erosión de la conjuntiva. Aquí voy a mostrar en este video una manera para hacer el recorte de tubo de la válvula de Ahmed cuando el tubo ha quedado largo y nos está generando problemas, sin tener que levantar la conjuntiva, tan solo haciendo una incisión junto al tubo con un cuchillete corneal. Vemos aquí que estamos haciendo una incisión periférica junto al tubo. Aquí vemos que estamos ampliando tantito la incisión y lo que vamos a hacer es, por el lado contralateral con una aguja de insulina, canalizar el tubo para que lo podamos movilizar y ferulizar el mismo, que nos sirva como soporte para poder hacer el corte con tijeras de vanas. Si no ferulizamos el tubo, la tijera simplemente al momento de cerrarse empuja el tubo hacia atrás y no hay manera de cortarlo si es que no tenemos un punto para estabilizar el tubo y que pueda permitir el corte por la tijera. En los casos en los que hay necesidad de colocar un implante de válvula de Ahmed y que el paciente tiene un cerclaje para cirugía de retina, a veces nos es muy difícil colocar la válvula o deslizarla hacia atrás, y aquí con una porción del paquete de las suturas hacemos un deslizador con el cual nos es más fácil introducir la válvula y nos permite salvar la obstrucción que hace el cerclaje para la introducción del plato. Aquí este otro paciente, debo decir que algunas veces, muy pocas, no hacemos la técnica de túnel escleral del doctor Gil. En este caso no lo pudimos hacer. Es un paciente con una escleroveitis, en el cual la esclera está extremadamente delgada, como pueden ver ustedes aquí. En este caso hicimos un abordaje directo a cámara anterior con el tubo, como se hace en otros lugares, y bueno, para evitar la exposición y la erosión del tubo, estamos colocando un rodete córneo-escleral con el cual estamos ocupando la córnea clara hacia el lado del limbo y el lado escleral hacia la parte posterior. Debo decir que este rodete escleral está rebajado al 50% de su espesor, también para que no sea un grosor muy amplio el que tenga que estar en esa zona y que esté en roce con el parpadeo y evitar problemas. Aquí vemos la fotografía de ese paciente tiempo después, en el cual vemos que se ha mantenido adecuadamente cubierto el tubo y está bien protegido sin problemas. Voy a presentar un video con el cual tuvimos la fortuna de ser premiados este año en el Congreso de Ascars. Este video fue presentado por una becaria del Hospital de la Ceguera. Y bueno,
This is a very straightforward and simple solution, but it's always a last resort to might need it. And although not the prevention is worth a pound here, we all know that sometimes things can happen. It's a good thing to now know about this good thing.
Y aquí está la fotografía de la paciente. Y bueno, pues recordando que ojalá todos los pacientes quedaran así, algunas veces no, pero bueno, espero que esto haya podido ser de utilidad para ustedes. Gracias.
Gracias, thank you. Mauricio, great presentation. I enjoyed when Mauricio came and visited us. You know, he came to learn something from us. Actually, we learned from Mauricio, as you know, a lot of our techniques and tubes and things, so wonderful, wonderful presentations. Okay, so I wanted to just share with you something to talk about a bit more on the office-based technologies. And I realize that we're getting toward the end of the glaucoma session. I know we have a couple of talks left, and sometimes we see the coma come, you know, in glaucoma. This was a presentation I gave in Canada a few years ago, and I was quite impressed with the audience. I noticed that some people were snickering, they weren't very happy. Others were starting to nod and fall asleep. This patient's kind of closing her eyes a little bit there. This person does not look very happy. This person's on their phone, right? Maybe Googling something else. But the best person was this one here. I mean, she really takes the cake. I mean, you know, not only is falling asleep, but I mean, her head back. I couldn't get a good picture, but there actually was some drool coming from the side of her mouth as well. So if anybody's sleeping here, I have my camera, and I'll make sure to take a picture of you guys when you're doing it, right? So anyway, just for fun. So I wanted to just do a quick overview on some of the new technology that we're using in our office. It's always changing. Some of it has been a early experience. Some of it has been used for some time. I won't talk too much about EMR in imaging, but we've completely gone, of course, to electronic records and imaging systems. This has been government initiated as well. But it's been some challenges, but certainly been helpful to have things well organized on a computer system. But a big learning curve. We'll talk about imaging in fields, NS7 OCT, looking at corneal hysteresis, home tonometry, and maybe some new technology in trabeculoplasty. So the first thing, of course, in glaucoma therapy is that we need to have a great team. The team makes a difference from when the patient comes into the office till their technician assesses and the diagnostic technologies. And I'm very lucky to have a great team. This is my team on Halloween. And they all dressed up as me for Halloween with wigs and long hair and goatees and Crocs and scrubs. So we've heard today already about imaging. This has become, of course, a mainstay in glaucoma therapy, being able to assess the RNFL objectively and fairly reproducibly, as well as the disc and the macula now has become of great interest. We, of course, have a bit more attention lately on ganglion cell analysis. I'm not sure how many of you use the ganglion cell or macula. Lots of debate. What do we look at? Do we look at the optic nerve, look at the RNFL, look at the ganglion cell analysis? I think studies are starting to show that they all seem to be helpful. This is a busy slide, but what this slide basically shows is that in some eyes, we see that the first changes in glaucoma progression may be on the RNFL before the macula. But in other eyes, the presentation may be in the macula before the RNFL. So my advice when it comes to imaging is look at all areas. Look at the disc, look at the RNFL, look at the macula, and continue to follow those parameters because the patient's presentation for progression may vary patient to patient. We also know, of course, the structure to function correlation. We heard about this earlier as well. And it's pretty amazing when we look and see how bad the RNFL is, how bad the disc is, but the visual field may still be fairly preserved. It's really quite alarming when we look at this, especially in a young patient, and we think, will this patient's vision survive? Being able to have printouts now that give us very nice structure to function correlation, looking, for example, at a structure to function overlay. Here we have the basically the RNFL overlay and the macular and the retinal neurofibrillar overlay structurally, and also in the background have the visual field changes. So we can actually look and see and compare. We have situations now where we have very good structure to function correlation of RNFL and visual field loss. Here we have visual field loss presenting over time as well as RNFL loss. Another example here where we see RNFL loss first, many years before it shows on the visual field. As Mauricio showed you, this is not uncommon when we have somebody with a normal visual field showing progression on RNFL first. The question is like this: when you have a normal visual field and you have RNFL loss, are we confident enough to say, you know what, we have progression, we are now going to escalate therapy or go to surgery? A few years ago, maybe we were reluctant, but nowadays I think more and more we become more confident looking at the imaging. As long as Mauricio said, as long as we don't have artifact and reliability issues, which is unfortunately sometimes a problem. As I said in my earlier talk, having the latest visual field technology greatly helps our ability to assess progression. We no longer need to set up a bunch of visual fields, look at a bunch of visual fields and follow them. We have a single printout with looking at VFI or mean deviation plotted over time. We have the event to progression analysis looking for areas of loss as well. This is a picture of our home in Toronto, and you can see it's snowing. But why is the driveway clean? Do anyone know why? Not because I shoveled the driveway in the morning. But I love technology. So what we did in our house is we used geothermal technology. You know, we know the ground is warmer if you go 200 feet into the ground. It may be minus 20 on top, but maybe it's like 10 degrees Celsius in the ground. So if we put pipes in the ground and bring the pipes up with ethylene glycol, we can heat the floors in the house and heat the driveway. So yeah, I'm a bit lazy, but technology is very helpful sometimes in managing these cases. I hate getting up at 5 in the morning to shovel the driveway because my boys don't do that. The angle is a very important part of the eye that often is underestimated and underassessed. And I think we have moved toward new technology, swept source technology, spectral domain technology to assess the angle in great detail. We can assess and identify the scleral spur, which is the first important part of the angle, because we usually can't see the trabecular meshwork on imaging, on OCT. We can look at Schwabe's line, looking at the end of the hyper reflected area of the angle. We can see the trabecular meshwork about 500 microns north or anterior to the scleral spur and the ciliary body band. We can assess very narrow and shallow chambers, and we can quantify specifically the angle opening distance, the trabecular iris area, very objectively, as opposed to gonioscopy. Again, we have very big, wide open angles here, like for example, a 56-degree angle here. Here we have an angle that's very, very narrow, a 10-degree angle here. These images now become automated. So the machine actually knows where the scleral spur is, can identify it, and give you a layout, and you can, of course, adjust it. Three-dimensional imaging in a patient with angle closure, nicely demonstrated here as well. And also looking at the angle opening after surgery as well. Of course, we know that UBM is still the most valuable adjunct to look posterior to the iris. We still use UBM as well as OCT to look. And of course, the UBM is helpful to look at IOLs as well. I know Carol and Jerry Shields are here. I should have presented our paper on imaging of angiosegment tumors. OCT, of course, has limited value in that area. And of course, we look at UBM quite commonly, again, also for IOLs as well. Another picture of our backyard in the winter here. So we know the cornea, of course, is a very important part of a glaucoma assessment. We know in the O study that corneal thickness is an important predictor of progression in patients with ocular hypertension. But it's a very simple attribute. Can we get more detail looking at corneal biomechanics? And we believe that there's an independent risk factor for the corneal biomechanics and the relationship between the cornea and the sclera and the lamina. So looking at corneal hysteresis, which is what the ocular response analyzer does, is a very interesting proposition. This is not just an air puff tonometer, but it actually assesses the corneal biomechanics. Think of the eye in this case as a shock absorber, with the pressure and the ocular pulse resulting in potential damage to the ocular structures. And how good is the eye at absorbing that shock wave? Hysteresis is a property that describes the response to a loading force. We, of course, understand this with viscoelastics. Think of shock absorbers. How well can a shock absorber take the force and absorb it? So by basically providing a pulse of air over a split second and watching the cornea and seeing how the cornea flattens and rebounds can give us an idea and tell us what the corneal hysteresis is. How good is the cornea at dampening? And based on the corneal dampening, this may relate to how good the sclera and the lamina can absorb pressure. In other words, if the cornea can absorb pressure very good, meaning a high corneal hysteresis, it's a good thing. If the cornea is very rigid and cannot absorb the application of pressure, may not be as maybe more of a risk. Some of the retrospective studies have shown that hysteresis is a very important independent risk factor for progression. Just like other factors like pseudoexfoliation, like visual field, other things like this as well are important as well. And we see that patients who have a low corneal hysteresis, less than 10 millimeters, have a higher risk of progression than those that have a higher corneal hysteresis. This was from the DIG study, the Diagnostic Innovation in Glaucoma study from the University of California, San Diego. And having a chart like this, where we compare IOP and hysteresis, is it perhaps the best way to look at IOP? Meaning someone with a high pressure, but with a high hysteresis is not as risk of developing glaucoma as someone with a lower pressure but a low hysteresis, because that patient with a low hysteresis cannot absorb that pressure very well. So the machine gives us a lot of value, a lot of variables. It gives us the hysteresis value, as you see here. It gives us a Goldman corrected pressure, and it gives us a compensated pressure, a pressure that's compensated for hysteresis. Here we have a patient you can see which has a very high hysteresis. Goldman measures 16.6, but the ocular response analyzer tells you with compensation is probably lower. On the other hand, someone with a hysteresis that is low, they don't have a good shock absorber. Their eye cannot absorb the pressure very well, and the nerve may be more at risk. Their actual pressure is actually higher than measured as well. So hysteresis is something I think that also may be added as a value in our office. You know, we use rebound technology. It's a great technology to use outside without anesthesia for kids. The idea to have a coil-mediated probe that basically then under high frequency can then be used to indent the cornea. This takes place very fast over a matter of 0.1 seconds. And what the machine is looking for here is looking at how fast the probe is decelerating. And depending how fast the probe decelerates, this basically gives us a computation for the pressure. The values are actually pretty reasonable to Goldman, maybe a little bit higher than what Goldman measures, but actually studies have shown they're actually pretty reasonable. The exception is when the pressure is very, very high, then the values become more erroneous. So as I said earlier, we now use this now in a built-in home device for patients to take home. You know, the problem with measuring pressure in the office is we get one pressure point. We don't have an idea what's happening throughout the day. We don't assess compliance. And so by having patients take the device home and measure their own pressure, it's a fairly straightforward pressure device to measure. It has the right signals to ensure we're coaxial, no anesthesia required. The good news is, of course, the patient doesn't know the pressure, so it will not tell the pressure to the patient right away, so they're not going to call you every few minutes. In a split second, the pressure is measured, as you see there, faster than the eye can blink, and we record the devices, the pressure on the device. The patient rents it from us for maybe a week or two. They bring it back, and we get a nice tracing. We ask them to keep a diary. Keep a diary of everything they're doing when they wake up, when they measure the pressure, before their drops, after drops, when they eat breakfast, when they're going to exercise, when they're at work under stress, when they're playing around, doing sports, when they're having sexual relations with their partner, everything we ask them. It's amazing actually when we ask this question, Joe, people don't have sex very often. I'm serious. We said, please record it in your document, and people don't, maybe they're embarrassed to record, I don't know. Anyways, I diverge. But you can see, we see actually some interesting patterns when we have pressure, maybe Dominican will be different. Maybe Dominican is different, right? Dominican is different probably, right? Okay. I can guess probably is true. And we can again see that we find interesting pressure fluctuations in these patients. So this may be another value we have to help us assess. Finally, to reticuloplasty, I think this is something that we all know and we do quite a bit, either as an adjunct or as an alternative medications. SLT has certainly emerged as a preferred option in many parts of the world. In many patients, as on the left, the patients can have a good response with high degree of safety. Patients with very high pressure, advanced disease, pigment dispersion, we have to be extra careful, of course, as well. And we see many studies showing that SLT and ALT, SLT and glaucoma medications like latanoprost, fairly similar in their results. What about repeatability? Well, it does seem to be repeatable, although as we do more and more treatment, the effect does diminish over time. We now see micropulse laser as a new technology. The idea is using 532 typically, or as a wavelength, to chop up the wave into small micropulses to reduce the thermal energy damage that may occur. And we see on structural analysis, on electron microscopy, that the trabecular meshwork is fairly well retained. This is a fairly straightforward procedure. It's a bit of a smaller spot size at 300 microns versus 400 on SLT. And although we don't have any head-to-head comparative studies, they appear to be fairly similar. These eyes are very, very quiet. We know the safety of trabeculoplasty. And the added value, of course, of micropulses, we have a 532 that can be used for retina as well. So if you're doing trabeculoplasty, ALT is still, I think, is still reasonable, although I think becoming less popular. And SLT, MLT are becoming of increasing interest. So we've talked a lot about different ways to assess glaucoma with structure and function. Angiotensin OCT as an added value in the office for assessing the angle in all patients with glaucoma, because angle closure can get missed. Corneal hysteresis as another way to look at risk factors for patients who may be at risk for progression beyond corneal thickness. And looking at home tonometry, I think, is another area of interest. We are now, of course, in the era of 24-hour IOP measures with contact lenses, which I didn't talk about, and intraocular measuring devices we have currently underway in studies, which will be interesting to show as well. And trabeculoplasty, of course, has become very common, not only at the end of the disease spectrum, but particularly early on. In fact, we often discuss first-line trabeculoplasty to patients as an alternative to medications, and many patients prefer this as an alternative for compliance reasons. So thank you again for allowing me to share the stage with Mauricio talking about glaucoma this morning. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos a hablar sobre cumplimiento y calidad de vida en el paciente con glaucoma. Cumplimiento, nada más para fines de definición, es que el paciente use la medicación de tal forma que la usa exactamente como fue prescrita por su médico. Y la calidad de vida es la percepción que tiene cada persona en un contexto de situación de vida, cultura y sistema de valores que va en relación a sus objetivos, expectativas, estándares y preocupaciones. El paciente con glaucoma típicamente es un adulto mayor que puede tener algún grado de discapacidad física, cognitiva, visual o auditiva, a lo mejor falla en estereopsis, que cursa con cierto grado de depresión, porque esto se ha comprobado en todos los pacientes con glaucoma, puede tener limitados recursos sociales, limitados recursos financieros y un determinado grado de cultura médica o health literacy, que es como traduje yo este término de la bibliografía. Y este término health literacy es la habilidad necesaria para poder entender las indicaciones de las recetas médicas, la información escrita sobre salud y el cuidado personal, los consentimientos informados que nosotros le damos a los pacientes, las etiquetas de los medicamentos y, como dijimos, las indicaciones que dé el médico, ya sea por escrito o verbalmente. Este estudio, en el cual evaluó los patrones de apego a tratamiento, no en glaucoma, sino en enfermedades crónicas, vemos que casualmente dio 6 grupos iguales, pero en cada uno de los grupos el patrón de apego o de cumplimiento fue muy diferente. Primer grupo, un apego casi perfecto. El segundo grupo con un apego con la aplicación de casi todas las dosis, pero irregularidad en el horario. El siguiente es un grupo que ocasionalmente olvida la dosis y irregularidad en la aplicación. Y después vamos ya disminuyendo muchísimo el apego, en el cual el paciente se toma vacaciones entre 3 y 4 veces por año, luego pacientes que se toman vacaciones mensuales de sus medicamentos y el grupo último de pacientes los que casi nunca aplican su tratamiento. Hay diferentes motivos de incumplimiento. Hay factores que son asociados o relacionados al régimen de tratamiento, factores que son asociados al paciente, factores del proveedor, es decir, del médico, y factores de la situación o del ambiente del paciente. Factores que son relacionados al medicamento. Vemos que cuando hay necesidad de hacer recambio del medicamento, el paciente a veces ya no acude por su medicamento y esto puede deberse al costo económico que representa el volver a comprarlo. La complejidad en el tratamiento también es una cosa que puede ser importante, sobre todo cuando tenemos múltiples frascos y cuando además tenemos tratamientos asimétricos entre un ojo y el otro. Cambios en la estrategia de tratamiento, es decir, si el paciente estaba acostumbrado a ponerse la gota una vez por la noche y nosotros tenemos que agregar un medicamento donde ahora tiene que ponerse en la mañana y en la noche, ahí hay situación en la que puede haber incumplimiento. Y los efectos secundarios, ya sea locales y sistémicos, que los medicamentos pueden generar a nuestros pacientes. Es importante saber que a mayor número de dosis, entre más frascos y gotas tenga que ponerse el paciente, mayor posibilidad de que no se cumpla adecuadamente y que además, ya decíamos, los tratamientos asimétricos van a disminuir el cumplimiento. Factores del paciente. La educación es muy importante. Entre más educado sea el paciente, mejor cumplimiento tiene con su tratamiento. Hablábamos de las discapacidades que pueda tener, discapacidades físicas, por ejemplo, para poder agarrar y presionar el gotero, los pacientes que tienen artritis reumatoide. Discapacidad cognitiva, pacientes que ya tienen olvidos de cómo deben de ser sus tratamientos, y los pacientes que prácticamente no ven y que a veces no pueden distinguir cuál es el frasco que tienen que usar en determinada hora. Decíamos que la depresión es un factor importante. Los pacientes con glaucoma típicamente están deprimidos y es una depresión que puede afectar importantemente en el apego a tratamiento. No hay motivación tampoco para que el paciente se ponga las gotas, porque el doctor le ha dicho al paciente que tiene una enfermedad que el paciente no sabía que tenía y que además el paciente no se sentía mal y empezó a sentirse mal hasta el momento que empezó a tomar el tratamiento para la enfermedad que él no siente. Y bueno, la comorbilidad, recordar que los pacientes con glaucoma no nada más pueden tener glaucoma, tienen otras enfermedades que podrían ser las más frecuentes, la hipertensión arterial y la diabetes mellitus. Aquí este estudio es muy importante y lo quiero comentar con ustedes porque es un estudio en el cual los pacientes se monitorizaron para saber si se aplicaban o no adecuadamente su tratamiento. Y el paciente sabía que lo iban a monitorizar y sabían que iban a saber si se ponía o no se ponía las gotas. Pues a pesar de esto, hubo pacientes que, aunque estaban monitoreados que no se habían puesto el tratamiento, respondían que sí se lo ponían. Es decir, los pacientes respondían que sí se habían puesto las gotas cuando no se las habían puesto y que además sabían que sus evaluadores iban a saber que estaban respondiendo con mentiras. Entonces el paciente, invariablemente, aunque no se ponga las gotas, si nosotros le preguntamos ligeramente si se puso o no se puso el tratamiento, van a decir que sí, aunque no se lo haya puesto. Factores del médico, aquí es cuando intervenimos nosotros. El paciente está no satisfecho con su médico, y esto es principalmente, por ejemplo, en la medicina institucional, en el que el paciente no puede escoger su médico. Problemas de comunicación y de indiferencia. El médico tiene que establecer una buena relación con el paciente y tiene que haber una buena comunicación para que el médico exhorte y exija al paciente que cumpla con su medicamento. Y la indiferencia por parte del médico, en el que no realmente le importa si se está poniendo o no se está poniendo las gotas. Decíamos que el cumplimiento no es detectado o interrogado adecuadamente por el oftalmólogo. Aquí vemos en este estudio que fueron evaluados los oftalmólogos. El 41% de los oftalmólogos evaluados pensaban que sus pacientes sí se ponían sus gotas. 44% de los pacientes sabían que sus pacientes no se ponían las gotas, pero a pesar de ello no hablaban con el paciente de este tema. Y solamente 16% de los oftalmólogos hablaban de la importancia sobre el apego al tratamiento. Factores ambientales o situacionales: el paciente puede tener limitados recursos sociales o económicos con los cuales sea más difícil poder tener un apego adecuado. Eventos, por ejemplo, de impacto de vida, por ejemplo, el señor o la señora que enviudan y esta depresión y este impacto de vida aunado a la depresión que previamente traía el paciente, pues es una situación más para no cumplir adecuadamente. Viajes en el que el paciente se va de vacaciones y deja su medicamento y dice, bueno, si estoy de vacaciones hasta del tratamiento de mi glaucoma. Y actividades en competencia, es decir, el paciente, la señora que se tiene que levantar temprano a hacer el desayuno a los hijos porque se van a la escuela y que a raíz de la prisa que tiene, por ejemplo, en hacer el desayuno y las actividades temprano en la casa, pues no se pone la gota como debe de ser. Y cambios en la rutina: si el paciente tiene su rutina establecida para tratar su glaucoma y el paciente sufre cambios en su esquema de actividades durante el día, esto puede generar razón de incumplimiento. ¿Cómo podemos mejorar entonces nosotros el cumplimiento? Pues, por ejemplo, evitar la polifarmacia. Entre menor número de frascos, mejor le va a ir al paciente. Cuando nosotros tenemos más frascos, aumentamos el costo del tratamiento, aumentamos la posibilidad de que el paciente no pueda pagar esos medicamentos, tenemos mayor posibilidad de que el paciente pueda olvidar que se tiene que poner las gotas, puede haber confusión en cómo se va a poner las gotas y tener un tratamiento inadecuado. Tenemos que mejorar la relación que tenemos nosotros como médicos con el paciente, tratar de ayudarlo a que establezca una rutina en cuanto a la aplicación de sus medicamentos y hacer un monitoreo adecuado con visitas frecuentes para ver si realmente el paciente está realizando su tratamiento adecuadamente. Nosotros como médicos debemos de tratar de simplificar el tratamiento. ¿Cómo lo vamos a hacer? Pues tratando de utilizar el menor número de frascos posibles con el menor número de gotas posibles. Así es que vamos a optimizar el efecto de los medicamentos y vamos a disminuir tanto los efectos secundarios por acúmulo de dosis de conservadores, así como también disminuir los costos del tratamiento, en lo que significa comprar numerosos frascos. La calidad de vida está profundamente impactada por el glaucoma en lo que corresponde a salud. Y vemos que los pacientes que tienen defectos en los campos visuales tienen mayor impacto de afectación en su calidad de vida, como podemos ver aquí en esta escala. Los pacientes de las columnas negras que tienen un mayor impacto en la calidad de vida son los que tienen defectos importantes en ambos ojos en el campo visual. El paciente también con glaucoma es un paciente que tiene miedo y es horrible sentir miedo, es horrible pensar que tengo la posibilidad de quedarme ciego, y también aquí tenemos que apoyar al paciente y decirle que si tiene un apego adecuado al tratamiento, la posibilidad de que el paciente pueda llegar a la ceguera pues realmente es difícil, y que los cambios en el glaucoma afortunadamente son lentos y los podemos detectar oportunamente para hacer el cambio de estrategia adecuado o lo que sea necesario para evitar que haya progresión del glaucoma. Entonces, por un lado tenemos que impactan en la calidad de vida la afectación en el campo visual del glaucoma, y por otro lado la enfermedad de superficie ocular. La enfermedad de superficie ocular es una irritación de la superficie del ojo que puede resultar en una variedad de mecanismos que no son infecciosos. Son condiciones que pueden ser tóxicas, alérgicas, inflamatorias, y que van a provocar una constelación de signos y síntomas ya conocida por todos ustedes, y que van a incidir directamente en el cumplimiento del paciente. Todos ustedes han visto en el consultorio imágenes como estas, alteraciones en la superficie ocular ocasionadas por el tratamiento médico del glaucoma. El problema de la enfermedad de superficie ocular es que muchas veces se encuentra subdiagnosticada, no se trata adecuadamente, y es cuando tiene su mayor impacto en la calidad de vida del paciente. Nada más para poner un ejemplo, 15% de los pacientes mayores de 65 años van a presentar enfermedad de superficie ocular, pero este porcentaje aumenta a prácticamente el 60% cuando los pacientes de esta edad están bajo tratamiento para glaucoma. Esta enfermedad de superficie ocular va a aumentar con el número de medicamentos, porque al aumentar el número de medicamentos aumenta la toxicidad por los conservadores. De ahí que ahora se ha tratado de hacer que la mayor parte de los medicamentos para glaucoma se encuentren libres de conservador, y sobre ese camino se está trabajando en la industria farmacéutica. Ahora, ¿cómo podemos evaluar la calidad de vida en los pacientes con glaucoma? Pues existen diferentes cuestionarios. El Ocular Surface Disease Index, existe también el cuestionario GQL15 y el Glaucoma Symptom Scale, que son cuestionarios que nos van a permitir saber qué tanto impacto tiene el glaucoma sobre la vida de nuestro paciente y sobre su calidad. Tenemos que hacer, cuando nosotros establezcamos un régimen de tratamiento o propongamos un régimen de tratamiento, ya sea médico o quirúrgico, debemos evaluar los posibles riesgos sobre los beneficios y tratar de establecer un punto medio en el que tengamos el mejor efecto terapéutico con los menores efectos secundarios posibles. Y aquí quiero citar prácticamente ya para finalizar esta plática, esta cita del doctor Harry Quigley, donde dice que si nosotros podemos hacer que el paciente se ponga adecuadamente su medicamento, sería prácticamente como agregar un segundo medicamento. Esto se debe al incumplimiento que los pacientes generalmente tienen sobre su tratamiento. Y como recomendaciones, recordar que debemos de simplificar y optimizar el tratamiento para poder disminuir efectos secundarios y el costo económico del mismo. El médico tiene que mostrar interés y generar el interés en el paciente para tener un apego adecuado. Debemos de estar atentos a los cambios que puedan generar progresión y daño en el campo visual, diagnosticar y tratar adecuadamente la enfermedad de superficie ocular y ser una ayuda no solo médica, sino también emocional para el paciente con glaucoma. Muchas gracias.